classes. I got a crazy teacher who wears dark glasses. Things are going great, and they're only getting better.
Welcome back. This is part 3 of the assertiveness, argumentativeness, and verbal aggressiveness video series. We're going to take a deeper dive into looking at the destructive side of the aggressive communication model. We've talked about the constructive category of the aggressive communication model. Let's take a couple of minutes and talk about the destructive traits and that side of the model. There are 2 elements in this category. One is hostility, and the other is verbal aggressiveness. Let's start with hostility. As you can see in the definition on the screen there, it's an attitude, a dislike of a particular person, object, or issue, accompanied by a desire to see this target injured or even destroyed, which is essentially a definition from social psychology's Erin Brockovich. Now, hostility shows up in communication of messages that have irritability, they demonstrate negativism, resentment, and suspicion. Those are essentially the 4 sort of sub-factors of hostility when you run it through all kinds of statistical processes. And since not much research in the communication discipline has been published on hostility, we're going to focus more on verbal aggressiveness. And the definition for that by Infante and Wigley as the tendency to attack the self-concepts of individuals instead of or in addition to their positions on topics of communication. All right, here we go. Let's dig a little deeper because this is the big one. Verbal aggressiveness. And the first question is, when does argumentativeness cross over to verbal aggressiveness? Now, I just said a moment ago that in the clip from the movie Spotlight, we heard the conversation slightly cross the line when there was a little name calling. And it quickly moved back. And I'd say, yes, technically that was verbal aggressiveness since there was name calling. But, he called him a crank. He didn't call him stupid. There were so many things. So technically, yes, but certainly we have all heard much worse. How do you figure that out? Well, determining whether it's argumentativeness or aggressiveness is about identifying the locus of attack. When the attack is on the other person's position, like, hey, we already covered that story, we did it thoroughly, that kind of thing, it's still considered argumentative. When the attack is on the other person's self-concept, he's a crank, then it's considered verbally aggressive. Let's take a look at a clip from the movie Erin Brockovich, produced by Universal Pictures, written by Susanna Grant. Please be advised this clip does contain adult language. In this scene, Erin Brockovich, who is played by Julia Roberts, finds her boss working with some people she doesn't care much for, and she finds it personally offensive.
Ed, I'm not saying it's not a strong case. If it wasn't a strong case, every demur wouldn't have been dismissed. I wouldn't be here. What I am saying is we still don't have a smoking gun that ties San Francisco to Hinckley. Something that proves that prior to 1987, PG&E Corporate knew the water was bad in Hinckley and did nothing about it.
Hey, Erin. I thought you were taking a sick day.
So did I. What's going on in there?
Meeting about the PG&E thing.
Are you sure?
Yep.
We can find it, or we don't have a big win.
Can I take a brief break here for a moment? I'll be right back.
And if you tell me to relax,
You told me you weren't feeling great.
Oh,
huh?
you know what? That is
I wanted
bullshit.
you to rest. Get in here.
If I was on my deathbed, if it helped you, you dragged me out of it. How could you take this away from me?
Nobody's taking anything. Will you listen to
Bullshit!
me?
You stuck me in Siberia dictating to some goddamn steno clerk so you could finish this without me.
They screwed up, Erin. Do I have your attention now? They screwed up and they admit it. The arbitration proposal they sent might as well have been written in Sanskrit for all the sense it made to the people in Hinckley.
I know. I spoke to Ted. Pamela Duncan wouldn't even get on the phone with
Pamela's
me.
got everybody seeing red with that letter she wrote to the press. She called us thieves. They're all listening to it. The whole thing is about to fall apart.
Why?
Erin.
Why?
Because before we even go to arbitration, we have to get the plaintiffs to agree.
How many?
Usually they're required to get about 70%. PG&E is demanding 90. In other words, everybody. Now, do you understand? This is serious.
And what? And I'm not serious?
You're emotional. Look, you're erratic. You say any goddamn thing that comes into your head, you make this personal, and it isn't.
Not personal? That is my work. My sweat, my time away from my kids. If that's not personal, I don't know what is.
Hey, come on. Come on. Go home. Get well. Because you're no good to me sick. I need you, all right? This case needs you.
Did you tell them that?
So you can see in this clip that she goes right after him. Even though he's trying to stay calm, she is verbally aggressive and emotional. She does everything short of name-calling, which kind of she does about the guys in the other room. So a great example of verbal aggressiveness, even when it comes from a good place. It's still verbal aggression. Okay, let's take a look at the types of verbal aggression. Now, there are some categories of verbal aggression, and meaning like it takes all kinds of different forms. And just a couple of examples for you. You can have competence attacks. He's ineffective by calling him a crank. Or character attacks. That's like saying, well, he's immoral or dishonest. Teasing and ridicule, which we've all experienced, hopefully not too much recently. Maledictions, which are wishing someone harm, like drop dead. Threats. Nonverbal aggression, which usually comes in the form of common hand gestures, at least in our culture, gestures that typically stand for something else. And I think you probably can imagine some hand gestures that you might have received or even given that demonstrate some verbal aggression toward people. And there are other categories as well, but those are the most common kinds of verbal aggression. Now, what causes this? Well, the researchers have identified that there are actually 5 causes, potentially. And of course, we don't know with great certainty right now, but there are potentially 5 causes. And the first one is psychopathology. And this occurs when an individual expresses previously repressed hostility. Usually it comes up later, maybe even years later. The second cause is disdain. And this is considered severe dislike or even hatred for another person or an object. Many of us have experienced the feeling of disdain and unfortunately probably been the victim of a verbal attack by someone who had a great dislike or disdain for us. Let's have a brief recap. We have 2 of the causes already. We've talked about psychopathology and we've talked about disdain. The third one is social learning explanation. And it suggests that we learn to become verbally aggressive from those around us whom we interact with or observe on a regular basis. Social learning theory says that our behavior is shaped by factors in the environment, and so consequently, people with whom we have frequent contact can greatly influence our communication behavior and personality. You need to be aware, though, that the theory also says that we only model those behaviors or copy those behaviors if we are reinforced for exhibiting those behaviors. So somebody would have to be reinforced or rewarded for exhibiting verbal aggressiveness in order for social learning theory to be the explanation that sticks. The fourth explanation is provided by Beatty and McCroskey, and they've coined it the communibiological perspective. And it has been argued by several communication scholars that verbal aggressiveness develops largely due to genetics. Okay, so that's what we're talking about here. Beatty and McCroskey have done a lot of work on this. And what they've done is connect it to temperaments, which is kind of like a group of personality traits. And that comes from Jung's work in psychology, communibiological perspective. This stands in direct opposition to social learning theory because this perspective says that we would get verbal aggressiveness from our genes. And while the Human Genome Project has come a long way, it hasn't come far enough to say for sure that we get our communication behaviors from our genes. We can say that as a result of functional fMRIs, that Beatty and McCroskey have been able to say, look, it looks like there's a part of the brain that's lighting up when people are verbally aggressive, and they're calling that neurobiology of verbal aggressiveness, or at least the first signs of that. So the fourth cause is the inherited trait cause, and the last cause is the argumentative skill deficiency cause. This explanation suggests that individuals become verbally aggressive because they are not motivated and because they don't have the ability to argue. So if I become verbally aggressive because I get partway through an argument and just can't think of something else to say, or I'm just not interested in continuing to try to contribute in a constructive way, then you might say that argumentative skill deficiency is the reason for my verbal aggressiveness. So those are the 5 causes. There isn't a whole lot of faith in any of the 5, although the inherited trait is certainly interesting and piques researchers' minds quite a bit. Kind of coming full circle now, we're going to come back to the big idea of personality trait theory as it was established by Eysenck and Costa and McCrae. A couple of communication traits, not just verbal aggression, we're going to couple them a little more tightly with the larger framework of personality trait theory. And I'll start by giving you a brief recap of the Big 5 model that we discussed in Unit 2. One of the personality traits in the Big 5 is neuroticism. It refers to the dimension that ranges from calm and relaxed to one that exhibits a great deal of nervousness. Questions that researchers or clinicians might use to determine if someone has neuroticism at a certain level are, do you often feel that life is very dull? Are you easily hurt when people find fault with you or your work? Are you an irritable person? If the answers are very strong to those questions, then a person may be identified as having a strong degree of neuroticism. So it's definitely on a range, as are all 5 of these. You either have a high degree or a low degree of each one of the Big 5. Extroversion speaks to how social a person is. It's also placed on a continuum. Questions that could be used to determine this dimension are, do you enjoy meeting new people? Do you often make decisions on the spur of the moment? Can you easily adapt to new situations? The third dimension we'll call openness. People high in openness place much value on emotions. They tend to be more liberal and manifest an ability to communicate credibly on many topics, and that's straight from our textbook that I used for this, the Aggression and Argumentativeness textbook. Conscientiousness, the 4th one, deals with how meticulous and persistent an individual is. People who score high on this are neat, organized, focus on tasks and task completion. That was conscientiousness. The last one is psychoticism. And psychoticism does not suggest that you are psychotic. That's a clinical diagnosis. Instead, psychoticism is more about lacking in feeling and empathy, being somewhat unconcerned about others, maybe even hostile towards them, maybe exhibiting a degree of inappropriate emotional expression. And it's interesting, psychoticism also often includes a disregard for common social conventions. So some of the questions that you could ask to determine someone's degree of psychoticism might include things like, do you think marriage is old-fashioned and should be done away with? Would you like people to be afraid of you? Would you take drugs which might have strange or dangerous effects? Now, in the communication research, just as an FYI, the Eysenck and Eysenck model has been more often used, but keep in mind it's been around for about 30 years longer. Lots of empirical support for it. The factor structure is very, very strong, and so it's been used more often. But the Big Five is getting more popular press attention. Next, I'm going to remind you of how the communication traits fit with personality traits. As I said, we're coming full circle here, and I'll summarize some of the consistent findings in the research about the relationships between these variables. All right, neuroticism includes several traits, or I shouldn't say several traits, several factors, and hostility is one of them, and the communication trait that we've been talking about is verbal aggressiveness, and it is one of the factors within hostility. Okay? I'm just reminding you of where these fit together and why do we care that they fit together. Argumentativeness, which is the other communication trait we've been talking about, is part of assertiveness, and assertiveness is part of a group of factors that belong to the Big Five item called extroversion. Finally, where the rubber meets the road. The relationships between the variables that we've been talking about can be summarized quite succinctly now that we have the breadth of the understanding of these constructs. This is really the good stuff. This is the stuff you can take to work and use right away. Over time and across many samples, we have seen that as argumentativeness increases, extroversion and openness increase. This means that for every time we see a high level of argumentativeness, we are likely to see a high level of extroversion and openness. Here's the caveat: we're not talking about causes. We're talking about when one thing occurs, what is the likelihood of another thing to occur. As argumentativeness increases, it's likely we will see neuroticism and agreeableness decrease. So in a person that has low neuroticism, we are not likely to see a high degree of argumentativeness, and vice versa. And finally, with regard to the Big Five, when you have a high level of verbal aggressiveness, we're likely to see a high level of psychoticism. Study of communication traits is based on the idea that identifying enduring trait-like predispositions will be the best way of predicting communication behaviors accurately. That if we know someone's communication trait level is high or low, we can guess how they will, or better, predict how they will communicate. The model of aggressive communication that Infante and Rancer put forward is a well-researched trait model. It neatly organizes communication traits into constructive and destructive categories and gives us a structure within which we can think. Argumentativeness and verbal aggression have significant relationships with traits in the Costa-McCrae and the Eysenck and Eysenck personality trait models, which gives us a really broad brush with which we can try to understand and predict human communication behaviors. This finishes Unit 3. I thank you for your time, and we'll see you next time.
Getting better.